In this special bonus episode of Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints, we are continuing our study of the unseen realm. And this week, it is going to take a dark turn as we focus our attention on the character and nature of Satan and the other fallen angels. This is always an intriguing and disturbing subject, and frankly, is one not talked about enough in our churches. Well, today, we are going to help rectify that deficit. Before we begin, though, I can't help but remember that 1968 sermon from Archbishop Fulton Sheen that I played from the beginning of this journey when we were discussing St. Michael and kicked this whole series off. Sheen said, and I quote, "We have almost forgotten that we are engaged in a great mortal combat. We have either domesticated the devil or denied him. He is most powerful when he is denied." Well, now almost 60 years later, I think we know what has happened. We, as a culture, have done both, domesticated and denied. Now, true confession here, but I needn't state what should be painfully obvious to anyone who has been following this podcast for any length of time. I fully admit my interests have always tended to the dark, weird, or obscure. It's just how I'm wired. And as a kid, I looked forward each week to shows like Night Stalker, my favorite show, or stayed up late to watch Chiller Theater on Saturday night to watch old horror movies. I loved them. I made sure never to miss the latest episode of In Search Of, especially if it was a documentary about the supernatural or the occult. And I cannot express to you how incredibly excited I was whenever a new horror movie was playing on TV or in the theaters. These things got me charged up like almost nothing else could. I highly enjoyed them, both as a little kid, and then as a young adult, and then even well into middle age. I was a fan from way back of the more shadowy side of entertainment. And perhaps it's because I was someone who had an unhealthy interest in the subject matter. Or, which is more likely the case, I really did not take the subject very seriously. Now, years later, and with more information, this topic hits me a little different than it might you, because I know from personal experience just how so very easy it is for us to do exactly what Archbishop Sheen warned us against, to completely domesticate the devil. Lord knows I certainly did for many years. And every Halloween, even well into middle age, I would get incredibly excited about the season. It was, I'm ashamed to admit, my favorite time of year. There was just something about all of it that appealed to me. The cobwebs and specters, the ghosts and supernatural, the black lights and orange pumpkins, the annual watching of all my favorite horror movies on TV. All of it just cranked my gears, all of it. And for years, my long-suffering wife, every October, put up with me dragging her through innumerable haunted house attractions all over the state. I could not get enough of them, but she absolutely hated them. To her credit, she was an incredibly good sport about my little predilections and patiently endured my annual Halloween excursions. My favorite one, and I will say, the best produced of any of them, at least as far as high-quality entertainment, was Busch Gardens in Williamsburg. They do it up right and very professional. Halloween is big business these days. And just as a side note, Halloween is the holiday that generates the second most revenue for businesses in the United States, only surpassed by Christmas. So, weird though I may have been in my tastes, I certainly was obviously not alone. All this time I was fully Christian, mind you. I certainly would not have considered myself enraptured by the dark forces, but I was just having a little bit of harmless fun. Or so I deluded myself. My delusion ended, however, because it was about 10 years ago, and poor Mary was being dragged through Busch Gardens' Hallow Scream again, and we found ourselves in one of the areas of the park that had been decked out in some sort of demonic theme. I mean, it's Halloween, right? What's more Halloween than demons? And right in front of us, a stage had been set up in the shape of a giant skull with glowing red eyes and simulated hellfire wafting up behind the DJ. The DJ was on the top of the skull, hard at his work, pumping out an endless hypnotic techno beat, pounding in the night air, while numerous characters dressed as demons gyrated wildly on the stage. Some local college students, obviously embracing the theme, had come to the park in some rather risque and highly inappropriate demon-themed costumes and were joining in the dance. It was at that moment that the thought hit me. What exactly are we doing here? What is being celebrated? And another thought hit me like a thunderbolt. It was the idea that if some peasants, for example, from 12th century France, were suddenly transported to this theme park this night and witnessed this, what would they think was going on? We know what they would think. They would think that this was a satanic black mass in honor of the devil. And who could blame them for thinking that? It would be hard to explain that it was all in good fun. And thus ended my fascination with Halloween and all things dark that night. And look, I'm not being a prude. I get it. I don't want to be the guy who spoils everyone's fun. But I think this personal story of mine illustrates a real danger. And the danger is not that obvious. It is not that going to a Halloween party is going to make you into a devil worshiper. That is silly. It is a danger that engaging in this sort of thing clouds your perception to the true reality. It is the very definition of domesticating the devil. We are making an object of horror, real horror, horror about the greatest enemy of man there is, Satan, into a harmless figure of fun. It is hard to have legitimate concerns about something you find humorous or fun. So, to illustrate my point, here's an experiment for next year. Go into any Spirit Halloween store next Halloween and just check out the endless number of demon or Satan-themed costumes. It's endless. It goes on and on. And by engaging in this fun, we make it impossible to think seriously about the real danger that the actual Satan and actual demons pose. This is what Archbishop Fulton Sheen warned us about, domesticating the devil. And it is quite obvious we have certainly done that. And I have no doubt that this pleases the devil immensely. And speaking of things that please the devil, another experience I had is a good example of Archbishop Sheen's second warning, that of denying the devil. Several years ago, we had a guest preacher at my church. Very learned man, many degrees in philosophy and theology. I think he was ordained as a minister in another denomination. Good speaker. And the gospel reading that Sunday was the story of Christ being tempted by Satan in the desert. We all know that story. And in this guest preacher's sermon, he talked about how he really couldn't think of the devil as a real entity, but he thought about him as a metaphor or a symbol. A metaphor for the human sin and evil that exists in all of us. I glanced around the congregation and saw many heads nodding at his words. Mine was not among them. I can think of nothing that would please Satan more than to have a preacher tell a church congregation that he is a metaphor. Metaphors are useful. I use metaphors all the time to illustrate points. I'm certainly not against metaphors, but Satan is no metaphor. He is a real creature, highly intelligent, far more so than any human, and is the most dangerous entity in the universe. A metaphor certainly poses no threat to your eternal soul. An incredibly powerful fallen angel, however, with a diamond-hard will and an intellect 1,000,000,000 times greater than yours, and possessing one single burning eternal desire, to eternally destroy you in hell with him forever, certainly does. A creature like that should be taken very, very, very seriously. Now, we should take the devil seriously, but we should not get morbidly obsessed with the subject. That was the trap that people in the Middle Ages probably fell into. And it is not difficult to see why they did. It is an incredibly important subject. In fact, is there a more important one? We should have a healthy respect for the danger of Satan and his fallen angels, however, but not overdo it. And turning once again to the always amazing C.S. Lewis in his classic work, The Screwtape Letters, a book, I might add, that is probably one of the best descriptions of how the demonic forces actually work on the individual, we should remember his warning. There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. This is good advice, but I think it is clear. Where we are right now in our culture, we have little danger of taking too much interest in being wary of the actual devil. In fact, it is quite the opposite problem right now. And again, thinking back to Archbishop Fulton Sheen's warning, it reminds me of Baudelaire's quote, made famous by the character Kaiser Sose in the 1995 movie The Usual Suspects. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world that he doesn't exist. I think that is exactly where we are right now, with many, many people. Sadly, many of them are church people, as that guest preacher illustrates, and that is extremely dangerous. So, exactly who is this character, the devil? Throughout this series of spiritual beings, we keep seeing him obliquely, standing right off stage in the shadows. We have discussed several fallen spiritual beings thus far, such as the gods of the nation, but we haven't really focused on what seems to be their leader, the devil. Well, once again, we turn to the Bible Project to help us get our bearings on this chief of all the rebels, Lucifer, Satan, aka the devil.
So we've been learning about spiritual beings in the Bible, and I still have a lot of questions about the bad ones.
Well, great. Let's talk about the Satan and demons in the story of the Bible. So let's start in the beginning. In Genesis 1, God creates a beautiful, ordered reality out of darkness and disorder so that life can flourish. He appoints humans as his representatives to rule over all of it, and 7 times God calls it good.
Yeah, I experience that kind of goodness often in the world, in things like beauty and truth, love and generosity.
But in Genesis 3, we meet a creature who's in a state of rebellion against his creator. We're not told yet why or how he rebels, but he's on a mission to ruin God's good world for other creatures.
This thing is trouble.
Yeah, this creature is the Bible's first portrait of evil. It distorts what God has purposed for good, ruining and dragging creation back into darkness and disorder.
So the humans join the spiritual rebel, which leads them back into chaos and death.
And from this point on, the human rebellion is interwoven with a spiritual rebellion. And the biblical story shows how this happens over and over again.
Okay, but wait. We're getting all this from a slithering snake?
Well, there are clues in the story that it's more than just a snake. Remember, Eden is a high place where the earth and its creatures overlap with heaven and its creatures.
So this snake could be a spiritual being.
Well, Genesis 3 points in that direction, and then later biblical authors fill in the picture. Like when the prophet Isaiah has a vision of God's heavenly throne room, he's surrounded and being praised by the spiritual beings.
Yeah, these are the cherubim around God's throne.
But when Isaiah sees these creatures, he describes them as seraphim, which in Hebrew means snake.
Ah, so the snake is like a former staff member in God's throne room. So why is he talking to the humans?
Well, the prophet Ezekiel understood this figure as a spiritual rebel who didn't want to live under God's wisdom and authority. He wanted to be God.
Oh, right. That's the same temptation the snake puts before Adam and Eve.
Exactly. He says they could rule the world like God, but by their own wisdom.
So they're all kicked out of the garden.
Yeah, God says this rebel will now crawl on its belly.
Where does it go after this?
Well, the biblical authors offer subtle clues where this being is at work behind the scenes, animating division and hatred between humans. They also use a variety of images to describe this being. It's a snake, or a sea dragon, or a dark desert creature, or the king of death in the grave. He's also given many titles, like Tempter, or the Evil One, or the Devil, which in Greek means the slanderer.
But his name is Satan, right?
Actually, no. Satan is not a name. It's another one of these titles, which is why in Hebrew it has the word the in front of it. The Satan means the adversary, because he isn't for anything, rather he's anti-everything, working through lies to drag us back into darkness and disorder.
That's intense. Now, what about these other spiritual rebels in the Bible called demons? What are they all about?
Okay, so remember the concept of God's heavenly staff team, the divine council, or the sons of God. In the Hebrew scriptures, we're told that some of these rebelled too.
When did that happen?
Multiple times, actually. After the snake comes the rebellion of the sons of God in Genesis 6. We're told that they have sex with women who then give birth to violent warrior giants.
Oh, right, the Nephilim. These are probably the strangest characters in the whole Bible.
Well, strange from your point of view, but ancient readers knew exactly what was going on. The ancient kingdoms around Israel claimed to be founded and protected by giant warrior kings who were part human, part God, and filled with divine wisdom.
Ah, I see. So the biblical authors are saying, hey, those warrior kings, they shouldn't be honored.
Right. In this story, they're portrayed as human rebels who are captive to spiritual evil, spreading their violence in God's good world.
Yeah, and one of those kings in Genesis 10 goes on to build the city of Babylon.
Yes, Nimrod, whose name sounds like the Hebrew word for rebel. And his kingdom leads to the next rebellion, where humans exalt themselves in Babylon.
But God scatters that rebellion.
And when Moses in Deuteronomy looks back at that story, he says that's the moment when God handed over the nations to worship the rebel host of heaven, the gods of money, sex, and military power. Moses is the first one to call them demons, that is, lesser spiritual beings.
So demons are spiritual forces at work behind corrupt human power structures.
Yes, but in the Bible, they also work on the personal level, animating and exploiting humanity's greed and selfishness, as well as the weakness of our mortal bodies. In the Bible, spiritual evil is at work in anything that drags God's good creation back into chaos, darkness, and death.
So this is why when Jesus arrives on the scene, he said his primary enemy is not human.
Right. Jesus and his first followers viewed all the pain and suffering in God's good world as a sign of its captivity to death and spiritual evil.
But they didn't think this was the end of the story.
Right. Jesus knew that the only way out of this cosmic ruin is to overcome evil and death itself, even if it costs him everything.
We first meet the devil in Genesis 3 with the following verse. Now the snake, which in Hebrew is called Nakash, was more shrewd than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Indeed, has God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden? That's Genesis 3, verse 1. Knowing that the seraphim, the highest order of created spiritual beings by God, are seen as fiery snakes, puts this passage into a different perspective. The devil appears to be a fallen seraphim, and knowing this makes this snake in the garden imagery that is so central to Christian iconography make a lot more sense. Atheists, such as Bill Maher, love to poke fun at Christians who believe in talking snakes. He's always talking about talking snakes. He made a whole movie mocking Christians who believe such things, religionists. I don't recommend it, by the way. But you see, once you know the truth about the devil and his status as a fallen seraphim, otherwise known as a snake-like higher spiritual being, you realize that there's a lot more going on here than some kid's story about talking snakes. This is why I'm so grateful to people like Michael Heiser and Tim Mackey for putting some of these naive views many people have of the Bible stories into their proper perspective. It makes for a more robust and less childish faith. And sadly, the childish understanding is one that many Christians have. If more Christians were better educated about these subjects, Bill Maher couldn't have made his movie Religulous. When I watched the movie many years ago, I remember thinking that I just wished that once during the film he had interviewed someone who had a true understanding of the Bible, and not one that they haven't updated since Vacation Bible School in 1974. But of course, that would be a different movie entirely, wouldn't it? And one I'm sure Bill Maher would not have wanted to make. As we have stated earlier in the series, the image of snakes, in this case flying snakes, came up in Isaiah's throne room vision. Here's the verse. In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. That's from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. So, the story of the snake in the Garden of Eden is not about zoology. It is about spiritual beings, namely, a fallen rebellious seraphim. Michael Heiser, about a year before his death, created a documentary called The Unseen Realm, which I have used extensively in preparing for this presentation. It is fantastic, and I highly recommend it. I'm sure it's available online somewhere. In the clip I'm about to show, he puts the rebellion in the garden into perspective, especially regarding human beings' divinely created role as imagers of God, and how that serpent, that fallen seraphim, was trying to thwart that. I hope you enjoy.
We represent God on earth.
How do we represent God? We saw how divine beings participate in God's rule. God created humans to participate in his plan to make the earth all he envisioned and to enjoy it with him.
Imaging God is a status we have on earth, not a specific ability. We bear that status from the moment of conception until death. To be human is to image God, but God also shares his attributes with us. Beginning with Adam and Eve, we were supposed to take care of creation and develop it. God wanted the whole earth to be like Eden.
The knowledge that all humans are representatives of God prompts us to see all human life as sacred. It leaves no room for racism. Injustice has no place, and the abuse of power at home, at work, or in government cannot be justified.
Obviously, the world isn't like Eden. People don't treat each other as equal imagers of God. Not even close. What happened? The answer lies in God's decision to share his attributes with both his supernatural and human children. And one of those attributes is freedom, or free will. It is freedom, not mere intelligence, that allows for meaningful choices. God didn't program his children like robots. If he did, we wouldn't truly be like him. Having freedom meant God's children might choose to rebel. That's what happened.
Remember, we don't have God's perfect nature. even though both humans and the heavenly sons of God represent him in their respective realm. God tells us in Job 15 that he doesn't trust his holy ones. He knows they can fail.
Look, he does not trust his holy ones, and the heavens are not clean in his eyes.
Eden was the home and headquarters of God. His supernatural and earthly families resided there. God wanted them to image him in their own ways. Heaven and earth blended together into one family, but one family member didn't like that idea.
We've all heard about the serpent in Eden, but why a serpent? What's that supposed to tell us? Ancient people knew how to take this scene, but we don't. We assume the serpent is merely an animal. His form is important, but the story is not about zoology. The story is about a supernatural rebellion. Isaiah alludes to that rebellion.
I will raise up my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mountain of assembly. I will make myself like the Most High.
Isaiah is talking about the sons of God in the assembly. Just like Job, he refers to them as stars. They were present before Eden. Ezekiel 28 mentions the rebellion in Eden as well. In Ezekiel's case, a guardian cherub gets kicked out of Eden.
You were an anointed guardian cherub, and I placed you on God's holy mountain. You walked in the midst of stones of fire.
Ancient Mesopotamian tablets talk about cherub throne guardians and describe them as snakes and dragons. The serpent of Eden was actually a supernatural being whose job was to guard God's throne. An ancient person would have known the scene was about a rebel in the divine council.
Like the supernatural rebel, Adam and Eve rebelled too. Eden was lost. The rebel security guard was cast down. He brought death to earth, and now everyone would die. He became Lord of the dead. Since everyone would die, humanity would be his. Now, most people know the basics of that story. Christians believe it's why the world is the way it is. But that's actually incomplete. What happened in Eden was just the first of 3 reasons why there's so much evil and death in the world. There were actually 2 more supernatural rebellions.
We'll be getting to those other rebellions shortly. But back to this snake business. In Genesis is the following passage regarding the curse on the serpent. Cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life. That's from Genesis 3, verse 14. Now, when I was growing up, I heard this sometimes interpreted as the reason that snakes don't have feet and slither on the ground. This is completely false and misses the point. What is being said here is far more than it appears. In the ancient Near East, eating dust was a metaphor for humiliation, defeat, and subjugation. The serpent, once described as crafty, is now condemned to slither on its belly, perpetually close to the earth, a posture of disgrace. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word for dust is gen, which can mean earth or matter, contrasting with Uranus, which means heaven. This deepens the symbolism. The serpent is bound to the earthly realm, while humanity is called to transcend it. The serpent's degradation foreshadows the ultimate defeat of evil, especially in Genesis 3:15, where the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. It is also a foreshadowing of the devil's new role after being thrown out of God's presence in Eden, that of being Lord of the dead. Satan literally swallows up the dead, and that is his domain, beneath the dirt and the earth, in the domain of the dead. And while we're clearing up commonly held misconceptions and myths about the devil, it is probably a good time for a quiz. Are you ready? Good. Where in the Bible does it refer to the fall of Satan and is taking 1/3 of the angels with him before the creation. Trick question. The answer is nowhere. If you believe that, you got that from Milton. His great epic, Paradise Lost, which is a good read, has unfortunately led to some mythological thinking creeping into people's understanding of the fall of Lucifer. There was no great meeting with Lucifer, conferring with the other angels and fomenting a rebellion before the creation of man. At least, there is not one referenced in the Bible. The closest the Bible comes to describing the rebellion of the devil in any kind of detail comes actually from the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, chapter 12, and I'll read the passage. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Milton obviously took this sweeping 1/3 of the stars out of the sky reference from Revelation as part of his inspiration for Paradise Lost. I mean, you can see that connection. But another thing about this that's very interesting is you see a lot of this imagery in the depictions of this woman in Revelation 12 and depictions of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe is coming up in a few weeks, and this Revelation 12 imagery is all over it. You'll notice the crown of stars on her head and the moon at her feet. This is straight out of John's vision in the Apocalypse. Reading on further in Revelation, we read, "Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, 'Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short.'" And notice who is leading God's army. Our great hero and friend of the show, the Archangel Michael, who started us out in this series. And who was thrown down? The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. The whole dragon imagery, based on what we know from our study of the angelic realms, makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it? But the story isn't over in Revelation. Reading on, "When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river, to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Is it not possible, if not probable, that this whole story in Revelation is actually referring to the birth of Jesus? That the incarnation of God in human flesh was the flashpoint for this great war in heaven? If you read the vision of John from that perspective, it kind of seems to match up. And did not King Herod, influenced by the devil, not try to kill the baby Jesus? Is that not what the story of the slaughter of the innocents is all about? The Christmas story is a lot deeper and darker than you thought, right? Going back to Genesis, consider the Cain and Abel story. Everyone knows this story, the story of the first murder on earth. Cain makes a sacrifice of vegetation, and his offering is not accepted, where Abel makes an animal sacrifice, and his offering was pleasing to God. In almost every commentary you read about this passage, the focus is on why Abel's sacrifice was acceptable and Cain's was not. They are all good to read and all have good points to make. But I want to focus on another part of the story, the one I think might be overlooked by some modern readers. Consider this fact. Neither Cain or Abel had ever been inside Eden. Their parents, Adam and Eve, had already been banished well before they were conceived. And they weren't getting back in anytime soon. Those ferocious beings we spoke about a couple weeks ago, the cherubim, were on guard to keep Adam and Eve and all their descendants out. But the closest place any human could get to God would have been right outside the gate of Eden, right beside the door. And this was, no doubt, where Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel would have offered sacrifices to God. The closest location to the divine presence, the door to the gate of Eden. It is referenced in the following passage. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, and you must rule over it." That's from Genesis 4, verses 3 to 7. And we certainly learned from the story that Cain did not rule over this creature, sin, which was lurking at the door. He was consumed by him, and thus Cain commits the first murder on earth. Note, sin is not referred to something that comes from inside the person, like we normally think of it, but as a creature lurking at the door. This quote-unquote sin that desires to have you is, many scholars believe, the other creature that was banished from Eden, the devil. This equation of sin that wants to devour you and the fallen angel, the devil, comes up again later in the Bible in the New Testament. St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, writes, "I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is the sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is the sin living in me that does it. Which brings up an interesting thought. Are your thoughts your own? Have you not had the experience where, despite your willpower or desire, suddenly and without explanation, a truly wicked and evil thought comes into your head out of nowhere? Where do you think that comes from? Now, psychologists would say it comes from your subconscious. And some Christians would say, justifiably in part, that it comes from the depths of your dark, sin-stained soul. But it might come from somewhere else entirely, outside of you, something lurking just beside the door. That is why this subject is so important to discuss. I'm dating myself terribly with this reference, but I can't help it. And I'm certainly not engaging in some sort of Flip Wilson, the devil made me do it theology here. We are culpable for our own sin, no question about it. But I believe we are definitely acted upon by other forces, higher spiritual forces, forces far more powerful and intelligent and dangerous than us. And because of this, we should be vigilant. And this is why we as Christians need to be focused on the real dangers from Satan. We often get distracted by minutiae. I mean, even my outrage at the ridiculous Olympics blasphemy in France in 2024, or the justifiable outrage engendered by a group of Satanists setting up a statue to their god, quote-unquote Satan, replete with goat head in front of the state capital of Texas, is a minor issue in the grand scheme of things. It is easy to get all worked up by these things, and of course, they are evil and should be condemned. But I think they are more performative and stupid than truly evil and dangerous. Most actual Satanists are nothing more than just anti-Christian trolls, performing their stunts in public to get a rise out of the church folk. They are not the real force of evil in this world, or even most of the problem that Satan causes in the world. They are just posing punks, cosplaying in goth costumes because they like the shock that they generate. More sad than scary, really. No, the real trouble is something far more subtle and way more deadly. I know we are running long today, but this is such a big topic it required extra time. I have one more video to share, but it's a good one and addresses the way the devil actually works in the world today. I'm a huge fan of Bishop Barron, and a few years ago he put out a video about the devil that I thought was just excellent. I hope you enjoy.
Well, in the 6th chapter of Mark's Gospel, we find the account of Jesus sending his disciples out on mission. They're going to preach, they're going to heal. But the first thing he tells them is, you have authority over unclean spirits. When they return from mission, the first thing they tell him is, we cast out many demons in your name. Now, when I was coming of age, I mean, even in the seminary, that kind of language was seen as, kind of primitive superstition, talking about devils, demons. Or maybe we tried to put a sort of literary spin on it. It was a symbol for evil. It was a personification of evil in the personal or institutional sense. But here's the thing. That approach just doesn't do justice to the Bible. The Bible knows all about personal sin. It's very clear about that. It also knows about institutional disorder and dysfunction, very clearly. But it knows about a third level, a third dimension, a type of evil that is underneath, if you want, that undergirds the other two, is more pervasive and dangerous. This level of truly spiritual evil. I'm talking about fallen angels. Now, Catholics get up every single week and we confess our belief in God who made the visible world and the invisible world. It means a realm of spirits, realities at a higher pitch of existence. What's a devil but a fallen or morally compromised angel? They're good and bad human beings. They're good and bad angels. But see, here's the thing. Think of a wicked person you know who's also very smart, very talented, and well-connected. That's a truly dangerous figure, right? When you combine wickedness with lots of other powers. So, a devil, an angel, a being at a very high pitch of intelligence and so on, who has gone bad, is a dangerous figure indeed. Now, do devils influence the world sometimes in very direct and frightening ways? Yeah. Talk to anyone involved in exorcism. I've talked to a few over the years, and some extraordinary stories ensue. But that's not the typical way that the dark realm intervenes. Usually it does so in a much more indirect way, by suggestion, by temptation. Something I featured in the Catholicism series, I think the most frightening religious painting in the world, at the Orvieto Cathedral, by the great early Renaissance master Luca Signorelli, much admired by Michelangelo, by the way. But you see these frescoes there, and the most striking one is a depiction of the Antichrist. It shows this figure, the Antichrist, and he's listening as the devil whispers in his ear, so kind of a classic symbol of this temptation. But what's really interesting is the devil puts his hand kind of in the vesture of the Antichrist in such a way that it looks for all the world like the Antichrist's own arm. And it's a very clever way of suggesting how the dark powers influence us, indirectly, clandestinely, by insinuation, in such a way that, heck, it looks like our activity. And in many ways it is, but yet it's the dark powers having invaded. Now, what are the signs of the demonic? What are the ways the demonic appears? Well, look at the names the Bible gives. The devil's called, in the Greek, ho diabolos. Our word devil, diablo in Spanish, le diable in French, all come from that. Teufel in German, too. Diabalein means to cast apart, to throw apart, to scatter. The great sign of the demonic is scattering. God is a great gathering force. Whenever things come together, when a community forms, that's a sign of the Holy Spirit. The scattering power, that's a sign of the darker powers. When families get scattered, when business organizations, when communities, when cultures get divided, that's the dark power. The other great name in the Bible is Satanas. That's the Greek that's based on the Hebrew word that means the accuser. The accuser. Here's a little experiment. Try this today. Examine your conscience and find out how many times in the course of the day you accuse someone of something. I bet you'd be kind of surprised. We do it a lot. It's one of our favorite indoor pastimes. Point the finger, blame, gossip, destroy someone's character, you know. The sign of the demonic is accusation. The Holy Spirit lifts up and confirms, you know, and affirms someone in his or her personhood. The demonic is the accusing power. Here's a related title I find fascinating. The Bible calls the devil the father of lies. God is truth. See, and truthfulness about ourselves, about our relationships, about our family, about whatever it is, truthfulness is always the path of light. It's the path that leads to smooth functioning, truthfulness. The sign of the demonic is deceitfulness, is untruth. Think now of the way an untruth about you has perhaps wounded you in a very deep way. Someone said something about you that wasn't true, it was a lie, but yet it wounded you in such a way that that wound is still festering after many decades. Think of the times you've wounded somebody with an untruth, you know? And again, the wrecking of someone's reputation, wrecking of someone's character by means of a lie, that's a sign of the dark power. Here's the last one, and it is the most frightening name. It's in the first letter of John. The author refers to the devil as the murderer from the beginning. God is life, right? God is life. Whatever enhances life is of the Holy Spirit. That's why John Paul talked about the culture of death. You know, the sign of the dark power is always an increase in death. It's a negation of life. You know, look at the 20th century, which is the bloodiest on record. There's no question about that. The number of people killed, you know, for ideological purposes in warfare in the 20th century was the worst ever. Can you explain that entirely through psychological or political categories? I mean, it just seems almost comically inadequate to the reality to say that, you know, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, etc., are simply explicable politically or psychologically. I don't know. There's something about the pervasiveness of violence and the destruction of life in the 20th century that is all the marks of the murderer from the beginning, you know? Okay. Now, so far, that's the bad news, if you want. Here's the good news. The good news is, and it's central to Christianity, is that Christ has conquered these powers. He's conquered individual sin, true. He's conquered collective institutional sin. But the Bible clearly witnesses to the fact that Jesus has conquered these powers. There's a great passage. Read it in the 2nd chapter of Colossians. Paul uses an image borrowed from his own time. When a Roman general won a victory, he'd bring the leaders of the captive nation back, and he'd parade them in chains through the street to humiliate them, right? Paul says Christ, through his cross, has done just that with the dark powers. He's chained them up and has now made a public display of them, he says. You know, we read that language now, we think, what's he talking about? That's exactly what he's talking about, is what he would have known as a Roman citizen, a citizen of that world, is, oh yeah, they're humiliating these conquered people. That's what Christ did through the power of the cross, which means we don't have to be beholden to these powers. See, that's near the heart of the Christian thing. They've been defeated, and we now can claim victory over them. What are the weapons that we have, if you want to stay with that kind of military analogy? The Mass, the Eucharist, confession, the sacraments, the saints. In other words, the whole stuff of the church you might construe as the weapons that we can use in the battle against the dark powers. Here's one of the sad things. As Catholics now in droves stay away from all those weapons, they shouldn't be too surprised that the dark powers can begin to have an influence over them. Or switch the analogy now to a medical one, especially with confession in mind. Suppose you have a bad cut, you know, on your hand, a deep cut, which you never attend to. You don't treat it, you don't bandage it in any way, no disinfectant applied. It's just this open wound. Well, what's going to happen? Is bacteria, germs, and so on will get in, and the hand will become infected. If you ignore that, in time your whole body will become infected, right? Think of sin. I don't mean trivial sin here, but I mean like that repeated habitual sin that we can all fall into as a kind of an open wound in your spirit. Untreated, what can happen is the germs and bacteria, if you want, in the spiritual order, the dark powers can use that as a way of getting in, a way of influencing you. Well, see, what does the church give us? The means to treat these wounds. It's called confession. It's called the confession of our sins, the reception of absolution, which treats that wound, you know. We have the weapons, we have the medical means, if you want, to deal with these powers, which have been defeated by Christ. But we have to claim that victory. We have to claim that healing. And I think that's right near the heart of the Christian thing to this day. As Jesus sent them out 2,000 years ago to do battle, he still sends the church out for the same purpose today.
And finally, considering how the devil operates in the world today, before we close out, just consider this one shocking and terrible fact. We often read terrible stories in the Bible, or from history, about ritualistic human sacrifice to a panoply of bloodthirsty gods. The gods of the Aztecs or Molech from the Bible are obviously evil. And when we think about the works of Satan in the world, it's quite natural to think of these incredibly dark periods in history as being when Satan's power was at its peak. Well, are we really any better now? Are we not doing essentially the same things today? Consider this. Since 1973, when Roe v. Wade legalized abortion nationwide, an estimated over 63 million abortions have been performed in this country. And for many people, in fact, the majority of people in this country, they see no evil here at all, or they just turn their face away from it. Well, I am sure the devil, who revels in the sacrifice of the blood of the innocents more than anything else, is smiling wide at this abomination. An abomination that continues unabated today. And to once again quote Archbishop Sheen, I will end with the poem that he concluded his 1968 sermon with. And here we go. I went to church the other day to free my soul from sin. I was looking for the preacher, but the preacher wasn't in. The sexton there assured me that there'd be no use in waiting. The preacher's gone away, he said, to do some demonstrating. What I want to know, I said, and I will make myself quite clear. While they're all demonstrating, who's running things down here? Who's taking care of sinners? Who's leading us in prayer? Who's feeding all the lost sheep that wander by right here? Who's baptizing babies? And another thing I said, who's looking out for sick folk and blessing all the dead? The sexton was a wise old man with a twinkle in his eye. He looked at me and scratched his head, and this was his reply. Son, what I'm going to say to you might strike you kind of odd, but since no one's here to help, put your question up to God. So I asked him all those things last night when I bent my knee in prayer. Oh Lord, I prayed, please tell me, who's running things down here? The Lord sent down an angel. It was enough to make me sob. When the angel said, the devil, and he's doing a damn good job. I apologize for running long this week, but it's an incredibly important topic, one that's not talked about enough, and so I did go long. And there was just a lot to cover. But rest up this week, get ready, because next week is going to be the craziest episode yet, as we finally get around to addressing that infamous Genesis 6 story. I promise you, it is going to be wild. I will see you next Saturday. Thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. Next week, we'll be exploring yet another hero from our Christian past. So be sure to tune in. Until then, keep your faith warm, your cappuccino hot and frothy, and have a great week. See you next week for another Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints.